In the episode right before this one, you learned why it's more important than ever for us as podcast hosts to understand that podcasting is a craft. And if you want people to flock to your podcast, you're going to have to be committed first to mastering your craft as a podcast host. And we explored the first steps to doing that. And in this episode, I've got Seth Silvers back with us to talk about this from the other side of the mic, specifically how to elevate our craft as a podcast guest. We're going to dive into exactly what steps you need to take if you want to start getting better results from your guest appearances. Welcome to Insider Secrets to a Top 100 podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Elmer. Let's make your business binge-worthy. Seth, in the episode right before this one, we had an awesome conversation of just about the overall need to increase the quality of the output of content that we're putting out as hosts and also as guests. We were talking about how hosts need to really put more work and more effort into their craft and to have higher standards for the guests that they bring on their show and some of the first steps that we can take as hosts to doing that. But now I want to flip to the other side of the mic with you because, as you know, many of us as hosts also guest on podcasts. And if a host is not taking the time to master their craft as a host, well, chances are they're not mastering their craft as a guest either. I know for me, in the early days of my show, I took a completely backwards approach to podcast guesting. And I would go out thinking, oh, this will be great. I'm going to get on as many shows as possible. I'm going to make my name known. People are going to know all about my podcast, and people are going to flock back to my podcast because my content is so valuable and so thought-provoking. And I face-planted hard because that wasn't the case. And I learned, well, okay, podcast guesting isn't going to work if you don't have the right intention or the right strategy behind it. Because at the time, I was only focused on what was in it for me. I was not focused on what's in it for the listener, or how can I serve the host's community better? How can I fill a content gap for the host? So let's talk about guest quality. And as podcast hosts, chances are you've had that experience where you've gotten a guest on your show and you can tell they have an agenda. So Seth, let's talk about guest quality. What are some of the top problems that you see happening right now in the industry with guests who are pitching themselves to be on other podcasts?
I mean, I think this is a really important conversation because I think a lot of people have, like you said, I've done it as well. You kind of go and you're like, I'm going to be a guest on as many shows as possible. Unfortunately, that often leads to you getting to be a guest on a lot of really low quality shows, or you kind of just having your talk that then you're not really contextualizing to a bunch of different places, being on all of these platforms. So you're kind of giving the same talk. So I think what happens with that is you're not really going to be able to go that deep, and results in the podcasting space come from like people that are deeply connected to deeper conversations. So I think just big picture, the problem is I think it's been very popular to kind of do this like spray and pray approach to guesting of I'm just going to go and be on any show. And I think the worst iteration of this is when people are going to be on a bunch of shows to try and sell their stuff. And then occasionally you'll find yourself on shows where the hosts only have the show to sell to the guest. And so you initially have two people that all they're trying to do, like I'm trying to sell you, you're trying to sell me. And the audience is forgotten. And so I think there's some really like interesting things that end up happening where we're in a place where people stepping back, probably being willing to be on less shows, probably as guests having higher standards for the shows that we're going to go on, and making sure that the shows that I'm going on as a guest, I feel like I can actually provide like listen-worthy value where, okay, I would listen to that show. And if it's not going to be that, then I think that we need to recognize, oh, there might be some benefit from it, but I probably need to respect my time. And I probably need to respect the host time and the audience's time and not contribute to putting an episode out there that nobody's going to listen to or that nobody's going to get any value from.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, if your goal is to generate, let's say, sales and leads from the guest episodes that you're doing, well, that's not going to happen if you're not giving some thought to how you can actually serve the audience who would be most likely to buy. And if you miss that opportunity to build trust with them, well, then guess what? Of course, your podcast tour and your guesting strategies aren't going to work. I hear from people all the time who say, well, I did that. I went on a bunch of podcasts and I got nothing from it. I'm like, but what did you give? And I heard this said once where an expert was sharing how when they walk into a room, they look at it this way. They're like, it's transactional. I'm putting air quotes around that in the sense that I can either withdraw or I can deposit. Is this a room where I can give something and really add to the conversation and add value? Or is this a room where I can learn something and where maybe I'm not the smartest person in the room? And in that sense, I'm withdrawing, I'm learning, I'm gaining, I'm growing. And I loved how she put that, because I was like, gosh, how many of us just totally forget that? And we show up in the true transactional sense of the word that, well, I'm just here to talk about my thing and I'm just going to sell my stuff here on this podcast. And that's it. And then we're disappointed that we don't actually get the result we want. So I agree. This is such an important conversation. And I'm curious to know, Seth, why do you think this happens? Why do you think there's not a greater respect for the podcast platform and the power that it really does hold when it comes to hosts inviting guests onto their show and guests pitching themselves to be on other shows?
That's a good question, and like something I want to be thinking about for months to come. Because it is exactly how you described it. I think that somewhere along the line, I think a lot of businesses have kind of realized like, oh, let's have a show with as many guests. And that was all built off of this assumption that like both audiences, both sides of the podcast interview are each one is thinking that the benefit is in the other. So the guest is going and hoping that the host has an audience that they are going to share. But in reality, the host is just hoping that the guest has an audience that they're going to share with it. If I'm guesting on 40 episodes in the next month, I'm not going to share every single interview I was on with my audience. I'm going to share this because this is relevant to people that follow me. This is relevant to people in my community. I feel like I'm providing value to your audience. I've listened to the show. I've like done my own research. I know that we align philosophically. Like it's like, oh, this is great. If people in my community started spending more time listening to Courtney, I would be happy with that. And so I do think somewhere along the line, it kind of was just like, okay, is this just a tool or is this a craft? Is this like an actual conversation? I don't know where like all of those shifts were. I think that there's somebody named Kelly. Have you ever connected with Kelly Mosser?
Yes, she's actually a guest expert inside our program, Pod Launch.
So I really like Kelly. Kelly is amazing. Kelly does amazing work with helping people to better prepare as guests. She encourages people to like actually have an offer, like not do this like soft pitch thing where, you know, we go on, we have a conversation. Hopefully people kind of like me. Hopefully people kind of they just call me at the end. That's what a lot of podcast guests do. And I think we're afraid to sell. Like we're afraid to say, hey, like I lead a team at a really amazing podcast production agency. So like, I feel confident saying that. And I know if your audience needs that, then like we would be able to help them out. But I think a lot of people are afraid of that because they're afraid they're going to like rub people the wrong way or they're not in front of the right audience. What I like what Kelly says, if you make an ask and you make an offer as a guest to the right people, it's great. Like if I have a problem, if I'm looking to buy a bike and an ad pops up and there's a bike, that's great news. Like, I'm not going to be like, oh my gosh, this ad popped up. But if I'm like looking to buy a bike and then like there's like Burger King and Taco Bell and Chick-fil-A and all these ads popping up, I'm like, gosh, I don't want to see these. So I think people forget to realize like if we're putting ourselves as guests in a community where we know the audience because we've done our research, we know we can solve their problem, and we actually offer to like give value, to give deposits to that audience, then there's not going to be as much friction. The friction comes when we are trying to make offers to audiences that aren't actually focused around those problems, which just requires that you as a guest do a lot more research and that you realize like, oh, I'm probably not the right person for that show. Or this show clearly doesn't really have a focus. Like they're just churning and burning out as many guests as they can. And so the chances of them actually having an audience that wants my product is probably pretty slim. All that requires work on the guest side, which a lot of people don't want to do.
It is. And so what they do is they'll go hire a podcast guesting agency and say, hey, can you get me on as many shows as possible? And we as hosts, those are the pitches we get in our inbox. That funny story about this, we had rebranded this podcast a couple of years ago, and then we rebranded it again last year as I have learned and evolved and grown in my journey and gotten more specific in who I serve and what problems we solve here on the show. And so people were still pitching us for the old brand of the podcast. It's like they didn't even take the time to notice, wait a minute, this is a completely different show than what it was back then, you know? And it's like, of course, we're not going to invite your guest onto the show because you didn't even take the time to consider who that guest is speaking to. And so I think this is a really valuable point, Seth. It's not that selling is bad. It's not that going into the conversation wanting to get leads and sales from it and making that offer is bad. It's that sometimes we're making the offer to a misaligned audience. We're making it with the wrong intention, and we're making it kind of like half-heartedly, we're just throwing it out there like, well, if you want to work with me, like, here you go, right? And I mean, people can hear that in your voice, that doubt comes through. And I want to back up to a couple of things that you said, which is the research piece and the solving of the problem piece, because this is the part that I see most guests missing the mark on. So let's say that a listener was your client, someone listening to the show right now, they were your client. How would you coach them first to research a show to know that it's worth their time?
So when we're working on a show, we want to see clarity on 4 areas. That's going to be a defined audience. We want to understand their problems. We want to understand like the content, like have a content strategy that solves those problems. And then we want to have a clear offer. The offer does not necessarily mean buy this $47 widget or buy this $10,000 coaching program. The offer simply means, is there a very clear way to turn people that are listening into somebody that you actually know their name, number, email address? There's 100,000 ways that you could do that, but the important thing is there's got to be clarity. So those are the 4 things that like we walk people through. I think on the guest side, you have to have clarity on who your audience is. And so if you're wanting to be a guest on shows and you're wanting to just be on kind of like any shows that have you, that's going to be really hard. And you're probably not going to make that much of an impact. So I think it comes down to having a defined audience, knowing what problems that audience has. Are you a person that can help solve that audience's problems? And then do you have a clear way of directing those people towards engaging with you after the show? So if you don't have clarity on those things, it's probably going to be pretty hard to see a really valuable ROI from it. And an example, we work and produce Patrick Lencioni's shows, our agency. And one of the first things that we recommended to them is, yes, like there's big shows that want you. You know, he's one of the top 5 business speakers in the world. He sold 8 million books, called the godfather of organizational health, like pretty important. And so there's big shows that like we're working on getting him on and that he's already been on. And there's been massive results from being on some of those bigger shows. But we also wanted to like target kind of like small to medium sized shows, because I've actually seen that shows that might be getting a couple thousand downloads a month usually are actually more loyal to like their host than other ones, than like these huge shows where it's just like these celebrity driven shows. So we did a lot of research and we kind of went to like a lot of like small to mid-market shows that were laser focused on an audience that we knew he is the person to solve the problem that this show is going after. And yes, he came with some name recognition, so it was an easier sell than some other people that we've done that with. But the hosts were like ecstatic at the thought of it, partially because he's a big name, but most importantly because he's a big name because he's been writing on this topic for 30 years. And so I think when you like have that match where you understand the audience, where you make an ask that's personal and where you know that like you can actually help that audience to better understand a problem, then that's when like the host is going to be excited. You're going to be excited. Everybody's going to hear it. It's going to be a quality conversation. All of that kind of like magic happens there. And I think a lot of people are, again, it's just kind of the spray and pray. Like, I'm going to be on 40 shows. It's like, it'd probably be better for you to be on 10 shows in the next year. And those be smaller shows, but then be the right shows. And you have like a solid connection with the host. Like you'll probably get more impact from that than just being on like the first 40 that say yes.
Totally agree. And on the note about solving problems for people, I find this is something a lot of people struggle with. They struggle with it in their businesses. You can see it in their messaging, and they definitely struggle with it. If they're a podcast host, we see it all the time. They struggle with it on their podcast, but as a guest as well, this is so important. You know, getting in front of the right audience is important, but if you don't know what problems you solve, and you don't know them to the depth and degree that you need to know them in order to communicate well that you are the expert to solve them, then you're going to have a difficult time converting that audience. And I often say it's kind of like if you were to go to the doctor and you had a headache. And this headache showed up a couple of weeks ago. And, you see doctor number 1 and he's like, oh, well, headaches could be caused by a bunch of things. Here's a prescription. You're like, thanks. Right? Like you didn't even take any time with me. You're supposedly the expert. You got the title, but did you really take interest in my problems? And so then you go see doctor number 2 and doctor 2 asks you all these questions and you feel like you're the only patient in the office that day. And they sit there and they take their time with you and they're asking you questions that they wouldn't ask you and wouldn't be able to ask you if they didn't understand your problem so well. And because of that, what happens? You trust them. So by the end, they're like, oh, here's the diagnosis. and here's how we're going to solve it. Well, now you're like, I'll do whatever you tell me, doctor, because you clearly understand what's going on here. And this is so key. And I think it's just, gosh, the mark gets missed on this all of the time. So I feel like this is something that needs to be said more in the podcasting industry right now, is to remove the easy button. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, because I think a lot of people are under the impression that podcasting is easy. And yeah, plugging a mic in is easy. Hitting the record button is easy. Hitting the publish button, it's easy from a technical perspective. But mastering the craft of being a host and of being a guest is not easy. It's simple, but not easy.
Yeah, I think that we just need to recognize and own the fact that, like, if something is easy, it's probably the value is probably not super deep there. So I love that, like, reference of kind of removing the easy button. And so I just think that if you are a podcaster or a business owner and you're kind of looking at like podcasting as like the silver bullet or the easy button for growing your business or growing your brand or accomplishing whatever you're wanting to, it is a valuable tool, super valuable, probably more valuable than you are thinking it is, but it's probably harder. We learned this the hard way with some early clients where we were working with like brand new businesses or coaches who are just launching their coaching practice. And they were super gracious and spent a decent amount of money on their podcast, honestly, like to produce it and to hire our team. We were super grateful. And we worked with them for a year and their business wasn't growing. And so they were spending a good portion of their revenue on us, which made it challenging because it was like, well, we need a disproportionate amount of results. When in the reality is they had other problems. They had like sales problems. They had offer problems. They weren't sure on their positioning. They weren't sure on their audience. And so it was like, I can create the best podcast in the world for you, but it's not going to fix a broken business. And so I do think that with the easy button, there's a lot of people that are coming into podcasting. They're expecting that podcasting will like fix a lot of their problems. In reality, like your podcast going viral or an episode going viral, it might actually cause more problems for you if on the back end, like your business and your brand isn't running well. It all comes down to expectations. What am I expecting out of this tool? Am I wanting as a guest to really look at this as, okay, I'm going to participate in podcasting in an area where I know I can solve problems, where I know I can be valuable. The hard thing with that is if you don't know what problems you can solve in a really deep way, you should probably spend more time working on your problem solving than on podcast guesting. And it's like, okay, maybe you're not ready to be a guest on podcasts. Like maybe you need to put your head down, you need to work, you need to actually grow your brand. You need to like have some stories, have a track record, and then go out and find the right podcast hosts. That's not as sexy. Like that's not as fun as like going out and being on podcasts and kind of going in and having this expectation that everybody's going to flock to you because you were on a podcast. But I think it's the right move. And so my hope in all of this is that just industry-wide, that we are moving more towards like me as a guest having a higher standard for where I'm spending my time and spending my time where I know I can really solve problems. That'll probably mean you're on less podcasts, but I think it's better overall for the industry.
Let's just drop the mic right there. I mean, gosh, Seth, it's so true. And I couldn't agree with you more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Courtney. Super happy to be here.
And I hope that for you listening to my voice right now, that you walk away with one new thing that you can implement for your show to help you get that competitive edge that you're looking for, but even more importantly, to taking the next step forward to being seen as that respected thought leader in your space. And speaking of a less is more approach, in the next episode, I'm going to show you why we have stopped measuring podcast success based solely on downloads and what you need to look at instead to measure the growth of your show. All that's coming up next to help you make your business binge-worthy.